Good afternoon, everybody. As always, my name is JC, and welcome to my channel, Every Man's Thoughts. Today's video will have spoilers for both episode 3 and beyond, so if you haven't already seen that episode, please hit the subscribe button and come back later. So with that, let's get started. A quick note, at about 7 minutes 45 seconds there is a fun conspiracy theory, and at the end of the video I will have a small announcement. We start with Matt and Rand having just escaped Shadar Logoth. Once again, Barney Harris just jumps off the screen and brings the character opposite him along for the ride. His ability to create palpable chemistry regardless of whichever actor he's working with has become a benchmark of the series. The first thing you notice in the scene is Rand calling out for Egwene, but Matt has his mind back home towards his little sisters. Rand refuses any idea of turning back because Egwene's headed to the tower, so that's where he's headed. The argument indicates just how strong Rand's feelings are for Egwene. In the past, we've seen Matt be able to talk to or even manipulate Rand into doing something he may not want to do, but in this case, Rand won't budge. He's going where Egwene is going, and Matt loses the argument. I find Rand's mentality here curious and worthy of dissection. On some level, either subconsciously or otherwise, he is acknowledging that Egwene has rejected him in favor of a new life. He's insisting that Egwene would head to the White Tower, but in his own words, there's no place for men at the White Tower. So what does this tell you about the realistic possibility of them having a future together? Yet, his feelings are so strong, he just can't bring himself to reconcile with the facts that he already knows. This brings us to the rough mining town of Breen's Spring, and yet another set design that looks fantastic, especially when you consider the show's budget and the fact this is likely designed for a single use. Once in town, we immediately see how desperate and vulnerable these two are. They're reduced to begging for a place to stay and get robbed to their face, and there's nothing they can do about it. It's in this time of need that the characters are introduced to barkeep Dana, played wonderfully, by the way, by actress Azuka Hoyle, and there's some damn good writing here. To this point in the series, we know the show embraces misdirection, and with Dana, it's done about as deftly as possible with what limited time they had to work with. As the viewer, you're naturally suspicious as to why this ancillary character is getting so much screen time. Or why is it in such a desperate town where everyone has a story, she's so readily willing to trust them and help them out? Then Dana starts the old song and dance about wanting to get out of this godforsaken town. The viewer then assumes, oh, okay, this isn't something I should be suspicious of, this is just lazy writing and they fell into that old trope. Then, to really sell the scene, Dana makes a play for Rand. So you assume not only is this lazy writing, but they're pulling every cheap trick out of the Melrose Place playbook just to fill a page. In reality, this was well done by design and the distraction was effective. We were completely oblivious to the fact that she is literally walking them into a tiny little jail. And I suspect most fans' heads were still on the corner of Melrose and Vine when Dana mentioned she knew who Egwene was. If I can digress for a second, I'm guessing at that point a lot of people were asking themselves, wait a minute, how did Dana know about Egwene? A few minutes later, Dana will mention her reverence for Ishmael. Well, Ishmael is the man with the flaming eyes that is stalking the adventurers in their dreams, and that's the obvious connection. There is also the possibility that they had a Dark Friend spy in Two Rivers. I'm actually going to cover that in just a minute. Anyway, back to the story. Dana has revealed herself as a Dark Friend. She has Rand at sword point. He's all alone and trapped behind a door he can't possibly break down. Yet, when he puts his mind to it, he goes through that door like Taco Bell goes through your colon at 3:15 in the morning. This is important because A, why the hell are you eating Taco Bell at 3:15 in the morning? And B, this is the first sign that we've seen of Rand having extraordinary capabilities. To this point, he's been pushed to the background and portrayed as little more than an impatient, pestilent child. Again, this show loves misdirection. Rand gets through the door, bumps into Matt, and they both take off down the street together. Next, you see Dana trucking down the street full speed with sword in hand in a scene that is far more intimidating than it had any right to be. Forget Moraine or the One Power. Thanks to my old frat days, I know how hard it is to run in women's shoes in a full dress, and her running them down was the most impressive thing we've seen on this show so far. This is when Dana explains that the Dark One wants to meet him, he actually wants to save the world, and it's the Aes Sedai who are lying to him. She also mentions Ishmael, which we spoke about earlier, and talks about how she's summoned a Fade. At this point, Tom kills her and tells them, hey, a Fade is coming, let's get the hell out of town as quickly as possible. Before we get to Tom, there's one more scene between Rand and Matt I'd like to talk about. When Dana offers them the opportunity to chop wood in exchange for a place to stay for the night, Matt objects, and this leads to a tense argument between he and Rand. It has been suggested this was the first time the darkness associated with Matt's dagger has presented itself. Unfortunately, with so little character development, it's hard to say, but I'm going to go the other way and say no, this was Matt being Matt. Rand was the one who talked Matt out of going back to his sisters. Rand was the one who said, no, we're not going to have drinks. Rand was the one who stopped Matt from getting his money back. It's perfectly understandable for there to be some underlying hostility. Furthermore, Matt's character is a bit of a fast talker or a grifter, scam artist, if you will. It's perfectly within reason to assume he may want to do something easier or even unethical in order to earn a few coins instead of doing hard work. Okay, now we can move on to Gleeman Tom Maryland, played by Alexander William. Apologies if I didn't pronounce that correctly. Again, we got some fine acting creating a memorable character, and if that was him singing, he's got some vocal chops too. There are some fans who objected to the absence of Tom from the earlier episodes because of his presence in the books. And based on the quality of the character we got in episode 3, I do think we did miss out. However, the first episode was already overly compacted, which threw off the pacing and played a large part in it being the worst episode in the series thus far. I just don't see how he could fit into episode 1, which in turn, because of the events depicted, also meant he had no place in episode 2. For what it's worth, his introduction in episode 3 was so good, I'm going to at least consider that a nod to the fans and just move forward. Despite the introduction, Tom didn't have a particularly big impact on this episode, with the exception of the scene with the Aielman. In the scene where they bury the Aielman, Tom shows Matt that even though he's a scoundrel or survivalist, he also has a sense of honor. Let's see if any of that rubs off on Matt in the episodes to come. As we transition to Egwene and Perrin, I promised you guys a conspiracy theory. This is a little fun, so hear me out. In the previous episode breakdown, I showed you that the wolves following Perrin are actually quite calm and peaceful. It's only in Perrin's mind's eye that the wolves are actually aggressive. This is likely due to a heightened sense of insecurity based on the fact that he's alone, wounded, and understandably afraid. The same thing happens again in episode 3 with Egwene and Perrin. The wolves are keeping their distance and non-threatening, but are perceived as a threat based on the character's current state of vulnerability. Later in the episode, Egwene, who is far more intuitive than Perrin, begins to realize, wait a minute, seems like the wolves are actually helping us. Like a sheepdog herding their sheep into the only direction where they could find salvation in the form of other people, food, and water. So I think we can safely say that the wolves are actually protectors of Perrin, which is in line with the narrative of the books. Now here is the beginning of the conspiracy theory. When was the only time the wolves ever acted in an aggressive fashion? It was when Perrin was sleeping and unknowingly entering into the dream world where he was being stalked by Ishmael. The very same Ishmael we spoke about earlier, who is a powerful dark friend. The wolves sensed his presence, began yelping and barking, which woke Perrin and got him and Egwene back on the move. Again, protecting. But let's take a step back and ask ourselves, what were the wolves doing during the dream? They were eating his dead wife. Were they protecting again? Were they signaling that she's not what she seems and maybe she's also a dark friend? Well, let's look back and examine what we know. When Perrin kills her, why is her weapon raised in an aggressive fashion? There are no more threats in the vicinity. In fact, Perrin beat his Trolloc into an unrecognizable pulp. Was she going to strike at him, maybe deliver him to the Fade? Second, remember when we meet her, she's very uncomfortable at Perrin's presence. At the time, we all just assumed this was some signal of marital difficulties. However, now, in hindsight, this could be anything, even including her not truly liking him or coming to the realization that she may have to kill him. I know it's not a lot, but when you combine it with the symbolism of the wolves devouring her, I suspect there's something there. Because this character doesn't exist in the books, nobody knows, and we'll just have to wait and see. By the way, real quick, when Season 1 ends, I'm going to do an entire video on theories and Easter eggs, so if that interests you, please hit that subscribe button. To wrap up Egwene and Perrin, the wolves eventually shepherd them to safety where they run into the traveling folk who are portrayed in a very stereotypical Roma fashion. Other than that, there isn't much to talk about with Perrin and Egwene. They appear to be in safe hands on their way to Tar Valon. So this brings us to Lan and Nynaeve. The most interesting part of their storyline for this episode was when Nynaeve uses a little guile and courage to escape the clutches of the Trollocs. She eventually outsmarts the dumb bastard and ends up killing him with his own sword. One of my favorite things is at the end when she flips her hair with authority. This brought back pleasant memories for me from when I dated a black woman who used to do the same thing. Her flipping her hair was your signal to know shit just got real. The frequency with which shit got real is why I'm no longer dating that woman. Anyway, eventually Nynaeve escapes and tracks down Lan and Moiraine. Nynaeve and Lan start off on the wrong foot, but the truth is they both need each other and that's their common ground. Nynaeve hates Aes Sedai, but the truth is Moiraine and Lan are her only path back to her friends. Lan doesn't care about anybody but Moiraine, however he needs Nynaeve to keep Moiraine alive. This forms the basis of their relationship until eventually Lan is desperate enough to go out and seek the help of the Red Aes Sedai. This leads us to this week's big reveal, which is the captured King Logain. Before I finish, everybody, I have a small announcement I want to make. Just like I did with The Witcher, moving forward, I'm no longer going to be comparing the relationship between the TV series and the book for The Wheel of Time. The various ripple effects just become impossible to keep track of, and the show deserves to be judged as a standalone entity. So from now on, I'm going to treat it as if the books didn't exist unless something particularly noteworthy or controversial happens. Well, that's it for me, guys. Please consider hitting that like or subscribe button, and I will see you next time.